Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Zeke Hernandez, who is a Max and Bernice Garchik Family Presidential Associate Professor at the Wharton Business School. He studies global strategy with an emphasis on how immigrants and innovation help firms successfully globalize. Welcome, Zeke.
Thank you, Gil. Good to be here with you.
A research area of focus for you is the effect of immigrants on location decisions made by firms, independents and multinationals, and capital providers like VCs and PE firms. You have also explored firm performance in this context. So I would like to start with one of your earlier papers in this area, entitled Finding a Home Away from Home, Effects of Immigrants on Firms' Foreign Location Choice and Performance, in which you investigated foreign subsidiaries of firms established in the US and the presence of immigrants from that firm's country in that US location. Could you talk a bit about that paper?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the basic question behind that paper is really a deceptively simple one, which is to say, is the movement of people correlated with the movements that companies make through foreign investment? And in particular, I was interested in one direction of that correlation and relationship, which is when firms are making investments abroad, do they take into account the fact that there are immigrants from their home countries in different locations abroad, and then does that have sort of a positive effect on the likelihood that they'll invest there and ultimately on the performance?
Yeah.
So that's the question, right? Is human mobility and capital mobility correlated, basically?
Right.
To give you sort of the summary of the study in a nutshell, that study was actually my doctoral dissertation several years ago. I was able at that time to get data on foreign companies investing into the United States from 27 different countries, if I recall the number correctly.
Yeah.
And I found, the core findings are twofold. One is that for every 1% increase in the share of immigrants from a certain country in a state living in the US, firms from that same country of origin were 50% more likely to invest in that state. By that I mean 50% more than sort of the baseline probability of investing had there been sort of no immigrants there from the home country. And then given that firms had located there, they were more likely to survive. And by survive, I mean just sort of stay longer and not fail, right? So it seems to immigrants seem to attract investment from their home country. make that investment stay there longer.
Yeah. So when you say that percentage, 1% people movement followed by 50% company investment, those are aggregate numbers. They are counts rather than quantity of investment.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, right? To understand what I actually found. So I mean, so let's take an example. Let's say that in the state of Pennsylvania, where I live right now, there were no Koreans, and then all of a sudden, the Koreans are 0% of the Pennsylvania. That share increases to 1%. So if Koreans now become 1% of the population of Pennsylvania, that 1% increase makes Korean firms, 50% more likely to establish subsidiaries and operations in Pennsylvania. So it's 1% of the total state population.
Is it, sort of the number of firms coming in, or is kind of the dollar investment? Yeah.
Yes. Another good question. Thank you. So it's the probability that they'll choose Pennsylvania compared to every other state
they
in the
make
United
a decision
States.
to enter, but this is really a location choice question. So they make a decision to enter, and then they say, which of the 50 states should I locate? And they tend to locate in a state with a higher percentage of immigrants from that country. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, very well summarized. And I also should clarify the baseline probability of investing in any state at any given point in time is low, right? It's maybe, in the particular sample I had, it was about 2 or 3%. So when I say a 50% increase, is that goes from, say, 3% to 4.5%. That seems small, but it's actually quite a big increase given sort of all the uncertainty that there is about making a foreign investment.
And then you go
into, with, right?
Some of the hypotheses around the reasons why this is happening, right? So what are the reasons you found in that?
Right. So I would say that the key word there is sort of knowledge or information, right? So I found that the reason is that immigrants help firms that have some kind of knowledge related need. So there were 3 specific hypotheses that I explored in that study. The first one was that foreign firms that had, say, no prior experience in the United States, so they don't have a lot of information and experience about what it's like to do business here, about the risks, et cetera. Right, those firms are very strongly influenced, or more strongly influenced than the average firm. The other hypothesis was firms that are what I call knowledge intensive, which essentially means that they're in a high tech industry, right, where there's a sort of a knowledge and tangible asset that they're trying to transfer from their home country to the United States, as opposed to, say, a low tech industry where perhaps some like intangible property is less important. So for firms like that are knowledge intensive, that have a lot of intangible assets, immigrants played a particularly strong role, allegedly because they're helping firms sort of transfer that information. And then the third is for companies that are trying to enter sort of a cluster of industries, right? And that comes from the fact that if there's a cluster, say like a high-tech cluster in Silicon Valley or the auto cluster in Detroit, there's a lot of industry-specific knowledge that's flowing through those clusters, and immigrants seem to enhance the ability of firms to benefit from those knowledge clusters. So those 3 hypotheses all get at this idea that what immigrants are doing is they're helping firms sort of obtain and transfer valuable information.
So I want to just understand. So highly knowledge intensive industry. So this is essentially the firm is trying to transfer some sort of knowledge intensive product or service to the U.S. and what you are suggesting is to actually make it really useful from a marketing perspective. They need a lot of help from the locals.
Yes, and where that comes from is from research that had been done before, showing that um, if you're going to be investing abroad and expanding your operations into a foreign market, but your competitive advantage, your secret sauce depends on what knowledge assets, intellectual property. So think of technology or a product or service that requires, say, high tech knowledge or very complicated tacit knowledge. That's much easier to successfully transfer and
Yeah,
implement in a foreign market than, say, a machine, right, that you just move,
right.
right, and immediately you can
Or some kind of commodity product.
on. Why?
Yeah,
Because that, or a commodity, exactly. Why? Because those intangibles, they require sort of human interaction. They're very tacit in how they operate. They require a very intimate understanding of the market, and the sort of the having a population of immigrants and knowledge, just because you have common language, a common way of thinking, a common way of managing, that just makes it easier to transfer those intangibles and use them successfully than, say, the commodities where perhaps you don't need that kind of similarity in human capital and
right.
language and other
So,
factors.
is this immigrant firm relationship sort of symbiotic? Both the firm and the immigrants are gaining from it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have asked myself that question. I I think so, but I have less evidence
Right.
to tell you for sure, right? I know the firm benefits. In principle, the immigrants should benefit for one of two reasons. Because the firm from the same nationality can, say, maybe be more likely to hire them or improve their job market prospects, right? They might be able to see the value of the skills that those workers have, perhaps more than a firm of another nationality who might just not, understand or relate to them as well. And the other is that the firm might be offering products and services that are valuable to that individual immigrant, right? I mean, something like food would be obvious, right? But maybe
Right.
other kinds of products. However, we don't have as much evidence of that, of meaning that when firms from, say, let's use Korea as an example again, move into a place where there's Korean, does that make Koreans better off? That's just not a question for which I know. Uh, I don't know if there's
Okay. Okay.
empirical evidence for that.
But if you assume that there's some sort of supply and demand benefits, either the people are buying
Yeah.
the firm's products, presumably those products are well known to the immigrant population, or they are getting supply of raw materials or labor or whatever, then yeah,
Hmm.
we should be able to see some sort of an economic effect on the immigrant population, right?
Yes, and that effect could show up in many ways, right? I mean, one is just sort of the improved, I guess, what utility or happiness of having a product that they
Yeah.
didn't have access to, right, before. But it could be, higher wages. Um, it could be another thing, because immigrants have very high propensities for entrepreneurship. One thing I could speculate is that maybe the immigrants might start firms that will sort of supply or be complementary to that home country firm that made the investment, right? And so, um, and there are
Yeah.
sort of anecdotal stories of that. So, for example, Freixenet is a Spanish wine company. They expanded into Australia because a Spanish immigrant who had moved to Australia years earlier told them that Australia was this
Hmm.
growing wine market, and that ended up being a good investment. But then that individual became Freixenet's first
Right.
official distributor, right? And so that person could start a business that was complementary to what
Right. Yeah.
Freixenet was trying
So
to do.
I also wondered, Zeke, I don't know if you have data on this. I wondered if this explains, sort of immigrant enclaves in countries, right? We see some clustering of immigrants, And I wondered, are immigrants voluntarily assembling so that they could gain from, some sort of co-national firm entries in the future?
That's a interesting possibility. We do know, so others have done research on immigrant enclaves
Yeah.
and the clustering of immigrants. So I have to give credit to them. And they have shown that, yes, immigrants cluster not just for social reasons, but also for economic reasons, because they help each other, say, often start companies, right? So, the in the Korea towns or China towns, for example, right? You see that immigrants help each other be entrepreneurs. They help each other,
Yeah.
get jobs. I don't know if it's also because they're expecting investment in the form that I studied. So you've already raised two interesting follow-up questions to this.
Sure.
I appreciate that.
I was, I mean, one idea would be, it appears that there is some kind of supply chain specialization that happens by immigrants, right? It could be a domain specialization like information technology, or it could be some sort of supply chain specialization. And if that is the case, then clustering would make those things work better, right? It's the same thing, when you see a shop specializing in a product, you see multiple shops around that specializing in the same product. So I guess that is sort of reducing the search costs for customers, right?
Yes, and so Bill Kerr, who's an economist at Harvard, has a research paper. I don't know if it's published yet, where he shows some of this. So he explores how there's certain like specialization by nationality. So, for example, if you're a nail salon owner, you're something like there's this huge disproportionate probability that you're Vietnamese, right? Or if you actually are a motel owner, there's a huge probability that you're from the Punjab region of India, right, with the last name of Patel. And that's right. And part of the benefit is the clustering, because these enclaves and the people that live within them sort of teach each other the craft and the skill, right? And they support each other if they need resources or if the business is facing a downturn.
Yeah.
So that's really neat
so I want to
research
jump into another paper
by
that
Bill.
you have, which is sort of in the same arena. So it is entitled, "When Do Ethnic Communities Affect Foreign Location Choice? Dual Entry Strategies for Korean Banks in China." So you're looking at here how Korean banks decided, presumably they decided again to enter, but to decide to locate their operations. How do they go about doing that, right?
Yeah, so in some ways the study is similar in structure to the one that we've just been talking about. The one difference is that, if in the study of, set in the US, there I was particularly interested in looking at sort of this mechanism of knowledge and information. In this study, we speculated that there's a further reason that immigrants attract firms from their countries, and that is basically trust. Right, that these ethnic communities function as essentially like these trust-producing machines, right? So if I need to do a business transaction with somebody else, I will trust them more if there's some kind of ethnic commonality that I have with them. If we're part of this tight community where and I don't just know you, but I know your parents and your cousin, right? There's multiple forms of sort of what we call social enforcement. And so we speculated that that's another benefit that firms get when they invest in these immigrant enclaves or immigrant communities. So we actually explored this in a very interesting context. So we looked at South Korean banks expanding into China, and the sort of the upshot is we found that indeed, sort of on average, those Korean banks were more likely to set up bank branches in provinces in China that had more ethnic Koreans. But the real takeaway is that effect, once we split these provinces into whether they had strong property rights versus weak property rights, we only found this ethnic magnet effect in provinces that had weak property rights. Okay. Now, what does that mean, right? That means a place with weak property rights, if you're a bank, is a place that has courts that are very ineffective, right? That doesn't have laws that are very clearly written, where it would be very easy for you to lend money to someone and for them never to pay you back, and you can never recover that loan. And so in a place like that has weak formal property rights, laws, courts, etc., then you can't rely on the formal set of institutions to enforce loan contracts. You have to rely on informal social enforcement. And so that's why, we think that these Korean banks were sort of significantly attracted to places with Korean communities if the province had, weak property rights. But if the province had strong formal property rights, the Korean community had no statistically identifiable effect on their location choice. And so that allowed us to sort of isolate this mechanism of sort of these communities playing that trust
firm's vote. Choice, but communities seeing that, is there any evidence that ethnic communities are gravitating toward locations with weak and unstable institutions?
So that's a really great question. I would say on average, I don't know if that would be true in some ways, because they wouldn't be very attractive places to live. In our study, though, of course, that would be a concern if there was like a systematic bias, right, where like the community is attracted to places with those weak property rights, and therefore the banks as well. So this is where the choice of research setting was really unique. And pardon me if I go down a rabbit hole of history here. But I think it's actually really quite fascinating on its own. So the reason we chose this setting is that Koreans have a very interesting history in China. So it turns out that during the period of Japanese colonialism in the early 1900s, when Japan invaded the Korean peninsula, a lot of Koreans, millions of them, about 4 or 5 million, fled to the northeastern part of China to escape the oppression from the Japanese. And they were hoping perhaps eventually to return when colonialism ended. But then this other unexpected event happened, which was that the Chinese Communist Party sort of took over in China in 1949. And there were 2 million Koreans that essentially were stuck in China. And they couldn't return back to South Korea because the South Korean government recognized the Taiwanese government as a legitimate government of China. Anyway, so this created this diplomatic rift between the two countries, and it meant that there was no exchange between them, no diplomatic relations, no travel. So what did that mean? It meant that these 2 million ethnic Koreans were sort of stuck in China, right? And they became one of the officially recognized minorities, and sort of over time kind of spread throughout different parts of China, but for reasons that had nothing to do with the entry of Korean banks many years later. And so the research design in this study is that we start our study in 1992, and the year is relevant because that's when China and South Korea normalized diplomatic relations, and that's when Korean companies and banks started investing back in China. Well, by 1992, there's this population of ethnic Koreans that was kind of scattered throughout China for reasons that had nothing to do with sort of the motives that the banks had to invest there, right? So it was in sort of the language of statistics, it was exogenous or uncorrelated with the motives of the firms. And so that allowed us to kind of make a claim that we have at least a plausible case for causality here, right? That there's not some underlying reason that's driving both the ethnic community and the banks to choose the same provinces.
That shows entry into an area that has formal institutions as opposed to more ethnic, ethnic enforcement, let's say. what the profitability differentials are between those two cohorts?
I would love to know that. We were unable to get profitability data. The banks just, I guess wouldn't give it to us, right? And I understand why. But so no, we don't know if there's a performance differential. There very well could be, right? So the only thing we can get at here is the sort of the factor motivating the location choice, but not whether this was good for performance. But some of the other studies that I shared with you,
I want to jump into
allow us to get at
another one of
performance.
your kind of more recent papers, Zeke. So this is it's entitled "Immigrant Entrepreneurs as Pathways to Foreign Venture Capital Investment." So this is sort of going in the other direction, where VCs in the U.S. invest in immigrant entrepreneurs. And then over time, they start to invest in that entrepreneur's home country. Is that what you're finding?
That's correct. Yes, I think that's you sort of caught the point. So I can get a little more into the details of what we found. Yeah. So it's exactly what you said, right? In the studies I've been talking about so far, immigrants move to country X, and firms from the same immigrant's home country also invest in country X. Here we're looking at a different phenomenon, which is the following. So, venture capital firms in the U.S., of course, have been very successful on average, and they've invested in a lot of startups, lately in high-tech startups. And for a variety of reasons, a lot of those high-tech startups involve immigrant founders, particularly in our case, immigrant founders from India, because Indians have come sort of in large scale, and they're very educated and have a lot of STEM skills. And so the question we had was, well, could it be that if a venture capital firm becomes exposed to Indian founders here in the US, just in the course of going about, investing in startups, does that then lead them to subsequently invest in India, in startups that are based in India, right? So the exposure to let's call it the knowledge and connections of these Indian founders who are now in the US allows them to sort of find out about attractive investment opportunities in India. And indeed, we find that that's the case. And the other thing that I really sort of like about this study is that we can get very granular about the mechanisms and why this is happening. So one of the things we can do is we can distinguish because we have a lot of information on who the founders of these US-based startups are. If the founder is Indian, we know we have a way of finding out if this individual is a first-generation immigrant from India or a sort of second or later generation. And so you would imagine that a first-generation Indian has direct experience, direct information, and connections about India, whereas a second or later generation ethnic Indian doesn't have that direct knowledge and connections. So what we find is that this effect of Indian immigrants on venture capitalists investing in Indian startups holds only if they're exposed to first generation Indian immigrants and not to later generations of Indians. And to get even more granular, another thing that we know based on where these individuals studied and based on the kind of linguistic profiles of their names is we know if they're from southern India or Western India or other parts of India. And so the other effect we find is that if a venture capitalist is exposed to more, let's say, Southern Indians, it makes venture capital investments in Southern India more than in other parts of India. And the same would be true if they're exposed to Western Indians versus other kinds of Indians. So it seems that there's something very specific. There's, immigrants are this channel of very specific information and connections, from the places in which they had firsthand experience in India. And so, why is that important? It's important in part inherently because venture capital is a big vehicle of spurring entrepreneurship. It's important because it tells us that emigration in the long run has what we call sort of capital benefits for the sending country, right? So immigrants go out And despite these concerns of brain drain that are common, it seems that in the long run, maybe those very same immigrants help
Right, right. And so
funnel
the
or
VC
channel capital
firm's
back to their
investment
homelands.
decision back, in this case, back in India, is that really driven by just affinity? It's one possibility. Do we have any performance data on their investments?
We do. So in the version of the paper that I sent you, it's a little bit of an older version. We're revising it at the request of a journal. And one of the things that we added in the revision was performance data. The best measure of performance we could get was whether the startup had a successful exit, meaning did it IPO, was it acquired or by another company or another investor, which are all sort of considered successful exits in the VC world. And we found indeed that venture capitalists who were sort of more exposed to first generation Indians here in the US, not only did they invest in more startups in India, but those startups were more likely to successfully exit. So it seems like it's not just some sort of ethnic or cultural affinity, but that there is sort of economically valuable information and perhaps networks and other forms of benefits that these ethnic networks are providing to the investors, to the American investors in India.
I don't know if this is a testable thing. I wondered if it is just an initial condition, sort of an issue. So if I run a new experiment, let's say I have, bunch of high-tech VCs here in Rhode Island, let's say, and I started off with a high VC concentration in high-tech in Rhode Island. And I'm just making this up. We have a higher concentration of Colombians in Rhode Island. Will I not see more VC investments in Colombia over time? Yeah,
that's what our paper would imply. So now there is a possibility, right? As always with research, there are caveats that there's something unique about India or Indians. I think that I can't rule that out completely, so I don't want to say. But yes, our paper would imply that if you're exposed to Colombians, you invest more in Colombia, and if you're exposed, say, more to Chinese founders in the U.S., you invest more in China. There is one thing we did in the paper that helped us back into that a little bit, although we didn't quite solve the issue, so to speak, is that we did know, even though we had mainly data on Indian founders, we did have data on the investments that VCs made in other countries. So, for example, we knew the investments they made in China, Israel, Canada, the UK, which are other big foreign destinations for US venture capital. And we found that Indian founders had no effect on the VC's investments in those other countries, right? So it's not, so again, it's not like this reflects some underlying preference for sort of foreign investors and foreign founders and foreign startups. It once again shows that sort of whatever mechanism is happening, which we're calling knowledge and connections, is again very specific to the country and even the sub-region of where these individuals come from. But again, that doesn't solve or completely sort of
what the data
address exactly
says.
what you asked.
Another
it's just a way to.
It might be that, and this might be unique to high tech. Let's say you start investing in Silicon Valley in high tech, and many of those firms may have relationships, outsourcing relationships, software development, things like that. And so I think you looked at Bangalore and Mumbai specifically. Let's say, you're a VC in Silicon Valley, you start investing in firms founded by Indian entrepreneurs, and some of the activities are done back in Bangalore. And so they have, sort of a continuous exposure, to that area. And that might be what is driving, further investments into new companies in the region.
Yeah, it could be. We were not able to observe those relationships because for startups, it's very hard to know, say, who their outsourcing suppliers are or something like that. But we did do something that we were trying to see if there was some kind of, sort of for lack of a better term, business relatedness between the startups that have Indian founders here in the US and then the Indian startups, back in India. And so one of the ways that we tried to run sort of a very stringent analysis was to say, okay, let's look at, for the exposure to startups with Indian founders you have here, we're going to look only at whether that exposure leads the VCs to invest in startups that are in industries that are completely different, completely unrelated to the industries of the startups here in the US. And even if we kind of slice the data that way, where we're kind of eliminating a lot of observations and making harder for us to find a result, we still find that the exposure to Indians affects investment in sort of these unrelated industries in India. So I think what you suggested very well could be happening, but this effect that they have on investment sort of still seems to exist even when what you're raising doesn't, is less likely to happen, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it.
Much broader effect. And as you know, investments very much, is driven by trust, comfort levels. I don't know the latest numbers, Zeke, but alpha generation in VCs haven't been spectacular from the 90s. So, it's, many of the decisions might be, it's perpetuated because, people kind of expect it. But it's not really shown in performance of VCs. I don't know what the latest data is, but... And so,
good point. That's a very good point.
Yes. You also look at another paper, immigrants and foreign firm performance. So there's some very interesting findings here. You sort of divide multinationals and independents, and you find interesting observations in those two buckets, right?
Yeah. So, that paper, in some ways, we're trying to address two big questions. So one is, what the three papers we've discussed so far have in common is that they make a very, I think, at this point, sort of strong case altogether that immigrants do affect location choice, right? They affect where investors choose to put their capital abroad. But there is a question now going sort of away from venture capital, but more into the sort of foreign direct investment that, say, a multinational firm would make. Is that decision good for the bottom line, for the profits of foreign firms, right? So meaning when you locate in places that have lots of immigrants from your home country, is that sort of a profitable decision, right? Or are you doing it for biased reasons? Maybe, I don't know, because you have an affinity for your co-nationals, but you should have put your capital somewhere else. So that's the first big question. Is this good for performance? And then related to that, to answer that question, we realize, well, maybe there's a difference between, multinational firms that are establishing a subsidiary. So think of, McDonald's or IBM or Google, versus what we call an independent firm, which really, I think the easier way to think about it is like a startup founded by a foreigner. Okay. So if we want to make it easy, let's think of, maybe this is too simplistic an example, but let's think of McDonald's establishing a restaurant, right, abroad versus a foreigner starting their own sort of restaurant, right, abroad. Okay, so we find that. Actually, let me tell you about the empirical context, because then we might get to that. So in this case, we looked at this in the setting of Russia. And I'll explain later why Russia, because it seems like a strange choice, but we look at foreign firms in Russia. One reason is because in Russia, it's mandated that firms have to report financial statements at the subsidiary level, so we can actually look at their profitability at that level. So we find that on average, the more immigrants live in a Russian province or Russian region, the more profitable that foreign firms are, right? If they locate where immigrants from their home countries live. So if it's, an American firm, the more Americans there are in that province in Russia, the more profitable it will be, we find that sort of for every 1,000 immigrants of the same nationality, the return on assets of these firms increases by about 4%, which is a big amount, right? But then the other wrinkle in this study is that when we compare the subsidiaries of multinationals, right? These are big multinationals, to these entrepreneurial firms started by individual immigrants. The wrinkle is that for the subsidiaries of the multinational, they experience this benefit of being where immigrants are, sort of regardless of the nationality of the manager that they put in charge of that local operation. So whether it's a Russian or an American. But if it's a foreign entrepreneur, it's very important for that entrepreneur to appoint an immigrant manager to benefit from the presence of the immigrant community. Why do we make such a big deal of that? It's because it helps us understand the mechanism by which these two types of firms benefit from immigrants. For the startups, because again, they have remember, a startup has no pre-existing brand or product that the immigrant community would know, right? So they can't relate to that firm other than through the individual personal network of the manager. Whereas a subsidiary of a multinational has a brand, a product that would be more likely to be known to the immigrant community. Again, McDonald's would be an example, right? All Americans know McDonald's. And so it matters a bit less if McDonald's has a Russian or an American local manager, whereas for Zeke's new restaurant in Russia, right? I don't have a track record that the immigrants would know. So the upshot, or the language we use in the paper, is that the benefits of these immigrant communities for foreign firms from the home country are real, but they're activated through personal channels for startups and through impersonal channels for multinationals.
Performance differential, that cannot be really explained by just demand side effects, right? People buying their product. I mean, it's much more elaborate than that. Yeah.
No, that's right. That would, certainly that is part of the story, but no, it's more complicated, right? And remember that profits can increase either because your revenues are higher or because your costs are lower. So we have some findings where we find that what immigrants are doing is both. They're helping these firms increase their revenues, and that's going to come either because the immigrants are consumers or just because the immigrants sort of make sort of native consumers aware of the product or service firm is offering. But it also helps firms lower costs. Why would that be? One, it could be my co-author on this paper, her name is Elena Colchina. She's at North Carolina State. She has a separate paper showing that for startups in particular, one reason they benefit from immigrants is that they're able to hire them and sort of use them more cost effectively. Some kind of ethnic matching between sort of managers and workers.
In conclusion, Zeke, I want to ask you, this won't follow from the papers, but in this unusual policy regime that we are in, that appears to try to shut down immigration altogether. Do you think immigration is a good thing?
Unambiguously, yes. I would say I would put it two ways. So economically speaking, all the sort of good, credible, peer-reviewed evidence is that immigrants help the economy in three dimensions. So you and I have been talking about investment, right? Capital is one of the basic inputs into economic growth, right? The greater the stock of capital in an economy, the more it grows. So this research that you and I have been discussing today, along with other research, not by me, shows that immigrants increase capital in the economy. Other research we haven't discussed today shows that immigrants also enhance innovation. So they bring new ideas, new technologies, new products. And then it also increases not just the amount of labor. So of course, more immigrants is more potential workers, but also the variety and diversity of labor. And research tells us that immigrant workers are complements to American or native workers. So I'm using America as an example, but it could be anywhere, right? To the workers that are native, meaning that they have different skills, they bring different talents that then help make other local workers more productive. So whether it's because of increasing amount and diversity of labor, the amount of capital and the amount of new ideas and innovation, unambiguously, the evidence tells us that immigrants are good for the economy. And the other side of that coin is that if you're, say, concerned about, so say you support immigration for moral reasons because you think it's a human
Yes.
right, or you think we need, to be kinder to refugees, or just give people from poorer countries an opportunity. You could think, well, increasing immigration, or at least allowing it, is still the right thing to do morally, but it comes at a cost. But it's a cost we're willing to bear because of the moral good. But I think the economic evidence tells us that in some ways there's a win-win, because economically, immigrants bring all these benefits. And on top of that, if you believe it's sort of the morally right thing to do, then it's also a moral win in addition to the economic win. So my opinion is very much informed by the empirical evidence. I didn't set out to study immigration. I set out to study economic
Great.
growth, and
Yeah.
it turns out
This
that
has been
immigration
great,
is really
Zeke.
important for that.
Thanks so much for your time, and good luck with all your research.
Thank you, Gil, and I appreciate how
Thanks so
deeply
much.
you read the
Bye.
papers and your interest in what I'm doing. It's very kind.